Hello and welcome to lesson 3 of week 3. My name is Mildred. In this lesson, we are going to look at another type of variable that can hold several values. This variable or this data type is called a tuple. Tuple is just like the list that we saw in the last lesson, except that once you create the item, you cannot modify a tuple. So let's create a tuple. Let's say student. We create a tuple with a pair of parentheses or round brackets, and then in that parentheses you can list all of the items. The items can be of any data type. We can also create a tuple using the tuple constructor, and the tuple constructor is written with, let's create a new student tuple, but you must use double pair of parentheses or round brackets like this. So we did this when we created a list using the list constructor, so it's the same thing with the tuple, and then you list the new items for the tuple. So let's say I want to put Eve, just one item. The tuple constructor like this, or you use a pair of round brackets like this, and then you put a comma. You must end with a comma if you have just one item in that tuple, for the system to see that has a tuple. So let's print this. So also indexing starts at 0. The first item is at index position 0 to the last item, and we can print an item of a tuple by referring to the index position like this, just as we saw in the list. Now for a list, you can change the items. You can add and remove items from a list, but for a tuple you cannot update or perform a lot of those methods that we had on the list. We can't do that on the tuple. What you will need to do is to convert that tuple into a list and then perform the operation and then convert it back to a tuple. So I'm going to print this, and then we'll see the item at index position 0 is Alice, and then we print all of the tuple out like that. So the indexing of a tuple is exactly the same as that in the list. So you refer back to your lesson on lists and follow the same process to apply slicing and negative indexing. So once you create a tuple, the rule is you cannot change the values that you've put in that tuple. So the properties of a tuple is that they are unchangeable or immutable. When you are asked for an immutable data type that can hold several values, it's a tuple, it's immutable. So if you want to change these values, you can convert it into a list and then perform all the operations we did in the list lesson and then convert back to a tuple. Let me show you how to convert a tuple to a list. So I'll use a tuple constructor to create this. Let's start over and let's have all the operations or some of the operations we had on the list on this tuple. I want to change the items in the tuple, but once created I can't do that. So what I do is to convert it to a list. Let's say student to list is equal to, I'll use the list method like this, and then I'll pass in the variable that holds the student like that. Alright, so now that I've converted the tuple of students to a list, the whole items in this student variable is now contained in the students to list, but now has a list. So you can check the type to be sure of the conversion. So we can say type students to list, and then when you print you'll see it's of type list. So we'll have a type of list. Now what we want to do now is to perform operations. Let's say we want to append something to the tuple. We can add item. They're unchangeable once they're created. We're going to add it to this converted to list and then convert back to a tuple. So let's say student list dot append, and then we're going to append, I want to add Eve. So append Eve, and then I'll convert back to a tuple, and I'll say students equal to, I'll use the tuple method like this, and then I'm going to pass in students. So we're going to look at the type of the students now that we have converted back to a tuple, and it's going to be of type while student to list remains a list. So now that you have added a new item, you can print out students to see what it contains, and you see that Eve is added and converted back. Alright, so we now have Eve at the end. So you want to refer back to your lesson on list and then perform all the operations that you want on the tuple after you convert it to a list and then convert back to a tuple. We are going to look at the only methods that the tuple has that doesn't have to do with changing the tuple once it is created. So another way you can do a tuple is you can add two tuples together, like I have, let's say, new student. This new student is equal to, once you declare a pair of empty brackets, put an item in it, let's say Frank, and you end with a comma. And because both of them are tuples, you can use the plus sign to add them together. So I can say all students, students plus, and then I want to print all students. And so we have all the students with the last franc added. So we added both these together. So we can unpack a tuple, like we say we have this tuple, all students with 5 items, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We want to unpack the tuple. So we can create variables. The number of variables we create must be equal to the number of items in the tuple. So we can do this by saying something like student 1. So this is how to unpack a tuple. So you can print each of these variables, students 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each of them will hold one of the value of that tuple. Let's do that and see. Not enough values to unpack. Expected 5 got 4. So we have 5 items. Oh, sorry, we're using students as a variable. So this is a good error that will lead me to illustrating I was talking about earlier. The number of variables must be equal to the number of items. Now we're using students, right? The student variable that holds just 4 items. That's before a new student was added. And so it's going to result in this error, value error, because the number is not equal. So what do? We change this to the all students variable that holds the combined tuple with 5 items, and now we're not going to see the error but to see it printed out. So this is a good error that illustrates what happens when the number of variables is not equal to the number of items in the tuple. Now another thing we can do is, let's say you are interested in the first and the last, and you want to unpack the first and the last in a variable. And one of the usefulness of this is, let's say you have a system and you want to get the best student, highest score from the database, and then you want to get the lowest score in the database, right? And so you want to unpack, or maybe all the values you get are all stored in a tuple, and you want to unpack this. So you can do things like highest, you want to put an asterisk, others, and then you put something like lowest. What happens now is this: it takes, let's assume that in that data or that tuple, everything you have is in ascending order. And so the highest will always be the first item, and the lowest will always be the last item. Now, we have 3 variables here. Is not equal to the total number of items in all students, which is 5. So put an asterisk in front of another variable name, which means that take the first item assigned to highest, look at how many more variables are left. 1 variable is left, so leave the last item out and put every other one in others. So it will continue to assign values to each variable you provide, and when it gets to a variable that has an asterisk in front of it, it now begins to count how many variables are left after this one, and then leaves out that number of items just in the same sequence it is organized. And so what we'll get now is to have the highest will be Alice, the lowest will be Frank because we added it there, and then Bob, Charlie, David will be assigned to others. So let's print it out to see the highest, the others, and then lowest. So we'll see the highest is Alice, the others is a list of Bob, Charlie, and David, and then the lowest is Frank, which is the last one. So you can see that it unpacked this into a list. So we'll see the application of this if you take the advanced courses where we start building softwares and apps, and you see where this is useful. So the importance of understanding all of these basics is that you need to remember them. You think about the solution to a problem. So we have seen how we can use the plus sign to join 2 or more tuples, and if you want to duplicate the item of the tuple, let's say I want these students to be duplicate, all I'll do is all students is students, or use the asterisk multiplication time the number of duplicates I want times 2, and then when I print all students, we'll see that it is duplicated, and we'll see it's duplicated. Alice, Bob, Charlie, David, Alice, Bob, Charlie, David. So we can also use a method to return the number of times a specified item occurs. So let's say we have all students and student times 2, which means we have duplicated. We want to get the number of times Alice occurs, which is 2 in this all students, right? So we can do that by saying num Alice all students dot count, and then we want to count Alice like this. And so when we print num Alice, we should get 2 because we duplicated it in all students. So when I run, I should get 2. Alright, another method the tuple uses is the index method, and the index method just finds the first occurrence of a specified value, and if that item doesn't exist, it will raise an error or exception. Index, and then when we print finally the index of the first occurrence, which is 2. But if it's not found, let's say for instance we do not have Frank because we didn't add the new students to this, so it's going to return an error because Frank is not found. Alright, this is where we end this lesson. In the next lesson, we are going to look at sets in Python. Thank you and see you in the next lesson.